one of the best-known musicians and most influential people of his time. As you heard Dr. Stephen Lynn at Roosevelt Hospital in New York City say, Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock last night outside his apartment building.
Mark had planned to kill Lennon, but he said my love had saved him. These chilling words from Gloria Hiroko, the wife of Mark David Chapman, reveal an unsettling truth. John Lennon's murder might have been avoided. Chapman, a self-proclaimed fan of the legendary musician, had already attempted to take Lennon's life once, but stopped himself. So why did he finally follow through just 2 months later? Is there anything else I can do for you? These were some of the last words John Lennon ever spoke, addressed to the man who called himself a fan. A kind gesture, a simple act of generosity. What Lennon didn't know was that the man standing before him, clutching a vinyl record, would become his murderer just hours later. Why would someone so devoted to John Lennon decide to end his life? And what caused Chapman to waver initially, only to commit an unthinkable act? To understand how such a tragedy could happen, we must first revisit the life of John Lennon, the man whose music, messages of peace, and global influence made him a legend and a target.
And I consider that my work won't be finished until I'm dead and buried, and I hope that's a long, long time.
John Lennon's story began on October 9th, 1940, in Liverpool, England, where he was born during the turmoil of World War II. Raised by his Aunt Mimi after his parents separated, Lennon developed a rebellious streak that found its outlet in music. At just 16, he met Paul McCartney, and together they started the Quarrymen, the band that would evolve into the Beatles. Along with George Harrison and Ringo Starr, the group became a cultural phenomenon, producing timeless hits like Hey Jude and Let It Be. By the 1960s, the Beatles weren't just a band, they were the voice of a generation. After the group disbanded in 1970, Lennon's solo career soared with hits like Imagine, a song that became an anthem for global peace. Beyond music, Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono were outspoken activists, using their fame to promote change. Through events like their famous bed-ins for peace, they turned their private lives into public protests, speaking out against issues like the Vietnam War. Lennon wasn't just an artist, he was a symbol for hope, love, and humanity's capacity for transformation. But fame came at a price. Lennon often spoke about his discomfort with stardom, famously saying, "We're more popular than Jesus now," a comment that sparked outrage and reflected his growing unease with celebrity culture. Despite this, Lennon remained remarkably accessible to the public. He frequently stopped to chat with fans or sign autographs outside his New York apartment, the Dakota. This openness endeared him to millions, but also made him a target. On that fateful December day in 1980, Lennon's willingness to connect with his fans would tragically be his undoing. His kind, trusting nature made him approachable, even to the man who was planning his demise. Lennon's life was a testament to the power of music and love, but his death revealed the darker side of fame, the chilling intersection of admiration and obsession. This balance between peace and vulnerability defined Lennon's legacy, but also left him exposed to those who sought to harm him. To understand how this tragic story unfolded, we must now turn our attention to the man who ended it and the disturbing steps that led him there.
You know, in retrospect, if I was trying to say that same thing again, I would say the people have the power. I don't mean power of the gun.
In October 1980, Mark David Chapman boarded a plane to New York City, carrying a sinister secret. His mission was chillingly clear: to kill John Lennon. At the time, Chapman shared his plans with no one, quietly stalking the Dakota, the famed apartment building where Lennon lived. However, standing on the precipice of this unthinkable act, something within Chapman wavered. Overwhelmed by fear, or perhaps guilt, he abandoned his plan and returned home to Hawaii. But this wasn't an act of redemption. It was merely a pause. Once back in Hawaii, Chapman shockingly revealed some of his dark thoughts to his wife, Gloria Hiroko. He confessed that he had flown to New York with the intention of killing John Lennon, but claimed her love had stopped him from going through with it. "Your love saved me," Chapman assured her. He told Gloria he had thrown the gun he purchased for the assassination into the ocean, symbolizing his supposed change of heart. Gloria believed him, desperately clinging to the hope that her husband could still change. But Chapman's words were deceitful. What Gloria didn't know was that his admiration for Lennon had already morphed into a dangerous obsession, one that continued to fester silently beneath the surface.
Burning me to death.
Yeah, I bet. Well, look, I'm been a lot of Sesame Street, me and Sean, so I know all the characters.
Despite his promises to Gloria, Chapman's obsession with John Lennon only grew stronger after returning home. On the surface, he maintained the facade of a man trying to grow as a husband. Yet beneath this calm exterior, Chapman was fixated on Lennon in a deeply disturbing way. His love for the former Beatle was now intertwined with hatred, a conflict fueled by Chapman's warped interpretation of the catcher in the rye. In Chapman's mind, Lennon had become the ultimate phony, someone who preached peace, but lived a life of fame and wealth that Chapman found unbearable. Just 2 months after his initial trip, Chapman told Gloria he needed to return to New York to clear his head and grow into a better man. Gloria, still convinced by his earlier confession of remorse, reluctantly agreed. "He told me to sacrifice being alone for a short time so we could have a happy marriage in the long run," she later recalled. What she didn't realize was that Chapman was once again preparing to carry out his horrifying plan.
They have the power to make and create the society they want. We all created this together. It wasn't a few kings or a few generals.
Far from abandoning his intentions, Chapman used this time to meticulously prepare. Contrary to his claim, he hadn't thrown his gun into the ocean. Instead, he repurchased ammunition and began plotting his next steps with renewed focus. This time, there was no turning back. Gloria had been his unwitting salvation the first time, but in December 1980, blinded by Chapman's lies, she would unknowingly watch him embark on a dark journey from which there would be no return. In early December 1980, Mark David Chapman arrived in New York City for the second time, now fully committed to his plan. But disturbingly, John Lennon wasn't Chapman's only potential target. Before settling on Lennon, Chapman had compiled a hit list of other famous figures he viewed as symbols of the celebrity culture he both craved and despised. This list included notable names such as Paul McCartney, Elizabeth Taylor, Johnny Carson, Ronald Reagan, and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. For Chapman, it wasn't personal. These were individuals whose fame represented power and immortality, and he wanted his name attached to that legacy. However, Lennon, living openly and interacting with fans in front of the Dakota, was the most accessible. Once in New York, Chapman began haunting the outside of Lennon's residence, the Dakota. He blended in with the other admirers waiting for a glimpse of the iconic musician. But for Chapman, this wasn't about fandom, it was reconnaissance. Each moment spent outside the building brought him closer to carrying out what he considered his life's defining act. Meanwhile, Chapman's mental state grew more erratic. He frequently read from his worn copy of The Catcher in the Rye, regarding himself as its protagonist, Holden Caulfield. In Chapman's delusion, Lennon had become the ultimate phony for living a life of luxury while promoting peace. His obsession with his imagined execution of fame overshadowed all other aspects of his life. Chapman was no longer hiding his mania. He was building momentum for it. During his time lurking around New York, Chapman's increasingly erratic behavior did not go unnoticed.
You could tell he was agitated. He sort of had he was sweating. He was
disheveled.
He'd clearly been up for a while. His eyes were dilated. He was really it definitely creeped me out.
One of the most eerie encounters occurred at a subway station, where Chapman ran into legendary singer-songwriter James Taylor. In a later interview, Taylor vividly recalled being accosted by Chapman, describing him as glistening with maniacal sweat and rambling incoherently about John Lennon. He pinned Taylor against the wall and spoke with frenzied energy, insisting that Lennon was interested in him and that he needed to make contact with the former Beatle. The unsettling interaction left Taylor shaken, but he had no way to know the nightmare Chapman was about to unleash. Chapman, meanwhile, methodically continued preparing for the murder. He bought Double Fantasy, Lennon's latest album, intending to use it as a decoy to get close to the singer. For Chapman, this wasn't just a chance to interact with Lennon. It was a calculated step in his ritualized plan. The autograph represented the irony of being personally acknowledged by the very man he was about to kill. The act of requesting it wasn't an accident, but a final layer in Chapman's delusion. He wanted to immortalize himself by staining Lennon's kindness with his betrayal. On the night before the murder, Chapman stood outside the Dakota, lingering in the shadows as regular fans and passers-by came and went. By this point, his resolve was unshaken. There was no second guessing, no last-minute hesitation, only a grim determination to finalize his obsession and make his mark on the world. Mark David Chapman viewed Lennon not as a person, but as a means to an end. In his twisted fantasy, this act of violence wasn't about hatred toward Lennon himself. It was his ultimate effort to carve his name into history. December 8, 1980, began as a productive and hopeful day for John Lennon. Reinvigorated after a long break from music, Lennon and Yoko Ono were collaborating on Walking on Thin Ice, a track they had been working on for Ono's upcoming album. Lennon poured his focus into perfecting the details of the track, reportedly telling a confidant that he was excited about the creative momentum they'd gained. It was a significant time for Lennon, as he had begun reconnecting with the world after years of relative silence, and he felt some of his best work was yet to come. Later that afternoon, famed photographer Annie Leibovitz arrived at the Dakota to capture Lennon for the cover of Rolling Stone. Initially tasked with photographing him alone, Leibovitz was met with Lennon's firm insistence that Yoko Ono be part of the shoot. The result was the now iconic photograph of Lennon, nude and curled up next to a fully clothed Ono. The striking image symbolized Lennon's deep love and dependence on his wife. Reviewing the test shots, Lennon adored the intimacy of the photo and made Leibovitz promise it would make the cover. After the photo shoot, Lennon participated in a radio interview where he spoke candidly about his life, his love for Yoko, and his plans for the future. His enthusiasm and optimism shone through in what would unknowingly be his final public words. Throughout the day, Lennon was fully immersed in creative and personal fulfillment, never suspecting the dark presence that was quietly waiting just outside his home. As John Lennon and Yoko Ono left the Dakota in the late afternoon to head to the Record Plant studio, Lennon's accessibility to fans once again became apparent. Outside the entrance, waiting patiently, was Mark David Chapman. Holding a copy of Double Fantasy, Chapman approached Lennon and requested an autograph. Lennon, always generous with his admirers, stopped, took the album, and signed it. In a chilling moment of kindness, he even turned to Chapman after returning the album and asked warmly, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" Chapman shook his head, smiled, and thanked him. Photographer Paul Gorsh captured this haunting encounter, not knowing it would be one of Lennon's final acts of generosity. For the remainder of the afternoon and evening, Chapman stood outside the Dakota, biding his time. As Lennon and Ono returned home from their studio session around 10:50 p.m., Chapman was waiting, having spent nearly 6 hours rehearsing his crime in his mind. As Lennon exited the car and walked toward the entrance, Chapman stepped out of the shadows, called out, "Mr. Lennon," and fired 5 shots from a .38 revolver. 4 of the bullets struck Lennon in his back and shoulder. In a desperate reflex, Lennon used his hands, those same hands that had signed Chapman's album earlier in the day, to brace himself. He staggered forward, collapsing into the building's lobby as Yoko Ono screamed in terror. Security rushed to assist him as Chapman stood silently, slowly pulling out his copy of Tom the Catcher in the Rye. He made no attempt to flee, instead sitting calmly and reading the book as he was apprehended moments later. Lennon was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, but was pronounced dead on arrival at 11:15 p.m. What began as a day filled with creativity and love came to a sudden, violent end. John Lennon's unyielding kindness throughout the day brought joy to others, including his eventual killer. But tragically, it also became the key to his tragic fate. The news of John Lennon's death was first delivered to the world in one of the most unexpected places. During a live broadcast of Monday Night Football, Howard Cosell, a veteran sports commentator, was tasked with breaking the unimaginable news to millions of viewers across the United States. Just minutes before the end of the game between the Miami Dolphins and the New England Patriots, Cosell was informed by ABC News president Roone Arledge that Lennon had been shot outside his apartment in New York City and was pronounced dead on arrival at Roosevelt Hospital. Struggling with the gravity of the situation, Cosell debated whether it was appropriate to share such devastating news during a football game. It was his co-host, Frank Gifford, who convinced him, arguing, "This transcends the game." At exactly 11:40 p.m., Cosell delivered the heartbreaking announcement.
Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival. Hard to go back to the game after that news.
The announcement left viewers in stunned silence. Fans turned away from their TVs and radios, processing the loss of one of the world's most beloved figures. In an instant, the focus of that night moved from a football game to a moment of collective mourning. Howard Cosell's broadcast immortalized the news of Lennon's death, a tragedy that resonated far beyond the world of music and reached into the homes and hearts of millions that night. Mark David Chapman's motivations for killing John Lennon were as twisted as they were unsettling. Much of his obsession stemmed from J.D. Salinger's novel, The Catcher in the Rye. Chapman carried the book with him on the night of the murder, considering himself a living embodiment of its protagonist, Holden Caulfield. In Chapman's mind, Lennon represented everything he believed Holden despised, what he called a phony. Chapman was enraged by what he saw as Lennon's hypocrisy. Preaching peace and love while living a life Chapman perceived as one of wealth and privilege. But Chapman's fixation on Catcher in the Rye went deeper than simple admiration. After shooting Lennon, Chapman remained at the crime scene and calmly opened his copy of the book. Inside, he had scrawled a chilling message. "This is my statement," signing it, "To Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield." This wasn't an impulsive act of violence. It was a meticulously planned performance to align himself with the fictional character who rejected society. In later interviews, however, Chapman began to admit an even darker motivation. It wasn't about the Catcher in the Rye or Holden Caulfield's ideals. It was about fame. Chapman craved recognition and believed that killing John Lennon would catapult him into history. In his own haunting words, "It wasn't personal. I just wanted to be famous." At his parole hearings, Chapman revealed the full extent of his chilling mindset, admitting that Lennon's fame was the deciding factor. If Lennon had been less famous than 3 or 4 others on my list, he wouldn't have been shot. That's the truth. Chapman went on to describe the murder as self-serving and evil, no longer hiding the fact that his actions stemmed from selfishness and a desire to shortcut his way into infamy. Ultimately, Chapman's perverse pursuit of recognition overshadowed any of the ideological motives he had initially claimed. In his confession during a parole hearing, he stated, "I'm sorry for being such an idiot and choosing the wrong way for glory." Mark David Chapman's act of violence forever tied his name to one of music's greatest tragedies, a chilling reminder of how far someone can go in the pursuit of fame at the expense of another's life. John Lennon dedicated his life to promoting peace, love, and unity. His music and activism inspired millions, transcending generations with messages of hope. Yet, his openness and kindness left him vulnerable to the darker side of fame, a side embodied by Mark David Chapman. Chapman's desperate need for recognition sharply contrasted with Lennon's humility and vision for a better world. His act was not driven by personal hatred, but by a twisted desire for notoriety, turning admiration into obsession and ending the life of a man who symbolized the opposite. Even decades later, Lennon's legacy endures, reminding us of the beauty of connection, but also the dangers of misplaced obsession. It raises a haunting question. How do we, as a society, balance admiration with obsession? And what can Lennon's tragic death teach us about the cost of fame in a world still searching for peace?